This is our family, and we came with Annie Mae, but we also have 3 other children, Hudson, Sahara and Japheth, and we've been working in Niger since 2008. We've been there for over the last 5 years, working with a people group called the Fulani. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we've gone about sharing the gospel with them. One of the reasons we wanted to go there was that we wanted to use agriculture as a way of helping people. Niger's in the Sahara Desert, as you can see there, and we also wanted to go somewhere where it was hard for people to hear the gospel. So we decided through God's leading that Niger would be a good place for us to put those 2 desires into practice. This is Niger close up. You can see 4/5 of the country is the Sahara Desert. The southern 1/5 is where people live. That's where all the towns are. And we spent some of our time in a town called Dakoro, just here. We were there for nearly a year, and then down here for just less than a year, the last term that we had there. We came back in September, and we're planning to go back again soon. So that's Niger. Niger is quite a big country. It's about 1,500 kilometers from east to west, and more than 90% of the population are Muslim. So I can see, I saw Bernie before. It's good that you've got a person like him lecturing you to help you know how you can reach out to Muslims, and I think it's wonderful to understand Islam to be able to reach Muslims. But I want to also suggest that one way that we can be all things to all people is also know about their lifestyle. Many of them, they're subsistence farmers, and so being able to help people through agriculture is another really good way of reaching Muslims. The Fulani people, they're in Niger. There's some who are nomadic, so some live like this. They move around every few weeks or few days with their animals, and they put all their belongings on the back of their donkeys so that they can move to better pastures. Their cattle is what they move around like this for. They love their cattle. That's their prized possessions, and so they feel that this lifestyle is really a wonderful lifestyle. And it's meant that they're a bit more open to the gospel because they're not attached to a mosque in the same way that settled people are. The settled Fulani live in huts like this. You can see in the top of the picture there's some mud brick huts with grass thatched roofs, and they plant crops, and majority of the people in Niger rely on agriculture for their livelihood. And very different to here, it's still done by hand, similar to what you would have seen if you're in Bible times. So it's not necessary to have done an agriculture degree to help people with agriculture. If you understand the way God made the world, then you can still help people in simple, practical ways. So I want to share with you how it came about that we had an opportunity to help people with agriculture. And we first, when we went to Niger the last time, we did 6 months of French study in Burkina to begin with. This was our front yard, and you can see it was pretty plain. The ground was swept bare every night by the guard, and so when we moved there, I asked him if he could, instead of sweeping the leaves and putting them in the bin, if he could put them on the garden so that I could start improving that soil. And then when the rains came, I planted millet. Millet's the staple crop in Niger. I wanted to see what it was like to grow millet so that when the time came, I could help people do that better. And then as the rains progressed, our front yard became like this. And so it's a 3-month wet season, and so people who looked across our wall, they could see that the millet was well above the wall and up to the top of the roof, and they were really curious why a white person would have done that. And at one point we had a fill-in guard, a young guy. He was called Yantema. He was studying economics at uni. He's the guy in the middle of the picture, and he came and he was quite curious why I had done that. So he asked me what I'd done to help the crops grow so well, and I explained to him that I hadn't added any artificial fertilizers, I hadn't used a hose, but that just through caring for the land it could grow really well like that. And so then after he'd finished his time, he came back and he asked if he could come each week and write down the ideas I'd been teaching him. And so that led to a course that I ended up teaching at a Bible school in Niger, and actually we taught together near his hometown at a Bible school there on how people could care for the land. And in this picture there was pastors and evangelists, and often they get given the worst plot of land and end up not being able to care for their families very easily. And so I thought, well, if we can teach them how they can care for the land, then they can be a really good light in the community, not just telling people the good news about Jesus, but also showing their people in their villages how they can care for the land so that they get a good harvest. So that's the background as to how I started teaching a course on improved land management. And so I want to pose a question to you. This is our friend Musa and two of his kids, Ephraim and Japheth. And I want you to imagine that he grew up as a Muslim and has recently become a Christian, and he asks you the question, now that I follow Jesus, how does that make a difference to how I farm my land? And I don't know if you'd have thought about that before, or if being here at MST, whether they teach you how you would answer that question, but I want to give you an idea about how you could answer that question. And first of all, I guess it's important to realize that Muslim people are often very fatalistic, and so when it comes to agriculture, it's the same. They say, well, if God wills, we'll get a good harvest. If God wills, the locusts won't attack the crop. And so getting beyond that is an important step as we make disciples. And so I want to start with the most important commandment in the Bible. Jesus was asked the question, what is the most important command? And he answered by saying, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. And then he added to it and said, to love your neighbour as yourself. And so if those two commands are fully obeyed, then the rest of the law will be obeyed, and we don't have to worry about all the different details of the law. And so in agriculture as well, if in the decisions that we make on our farm, if we think about our love for God or our love for our neighbour in the decisions we make, that will affect whether we negatively care for the land or not. If we cut the trees down and that means our grandkids don't have enough firewood, well then we shouldn't cut the trees down in that way. We should do it in a way that's sustainable. And so that was the starting point for answering this question. And then the best place to begin is at the beginning. It's so good that God gave us Genesis 1 and 2 to show us his intention when he made the world. And so when he made it, he said to the man and animals, he said, multiply, increase in number, and fill the earth. And he said that the provisions for them were the green plants and the fruit of the trees. And when he'd finished creating, he said it was very good. So when you put those two things together, the command to multiply and then the provision that God gave them, then you have to think, well, then if we were to fill the earth, then the earth also had to be full of plants and trees to feed those who filled the earth. And so when you see in the dry season a scene like this in Niger, it's got the highest birth rate in the world, but in the dry season there's not a blade of grass left in many areas. Even the trees have dropped their leaves and there's not much fruit left. So often you might hear stories of Niger and you hear that it's another hunger year. That's one of the reasons, that they've tried to multiply and increase in number, but they haven't thought about the food that they need to feed themselves. They haven't also allowed the plants to multiply and increase to be able to feed them. So there's a great role that we can have in helping people know how to care for the land so that they have enough food to eat. In Genesis 3, you know that there was the curse that they were disobedient, so instead of enjoying the garden that God had given them to live in, they had to go and toil to have enough food to eat. And you can see in this picture, many people in Niger live in very difficult situations, and even so they can still get enough food to eat, but it's a real struggle. And then working through Genesis, you get to Genesis 6, and it says that instead of the world being full of the good things that God wanted, it was full of violence. And so God was upset and wanted to destroy what he'd made. But our God's gracious and compassionate. He saw Noah as a righteous man and wanted to save the world through him and also save all the different animals. And so these are two of our kids, and I'll move on, as time's limited. So then you keep going through the books of Moses and you find that God chose a people for himself, and not only did he choose a people, but he wanted to take them to a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So we can see that the causes or the result of their disobedience in Genesis 3 is not God's intention for his people. He wants them to be in a good land, a land where they have enough food to eat. And if it's got milk and honey, then it must have lots of trees and lots of cows. And that's really good for the Fulani because they love their cows. And so they even let their cattle use their head as a salt lick. And so the land that God had promised to his people was a really good land. But like in the garden, they had a rule to follow. They had to not eat from the tree in the garden. in the promised land, they also were given a law so that God could dwell with them. And God said that if they were obedient, there would be great blessing. And this is a picture of the land of blessing. Natalie drew this to help with my teaching classes. You can see in this land the millet has grown really well, the cattle are fat, the trees are really lovely. The lady's happy pounding grain with the baby on her back. It rains, and the rain nourishes the soil and helps keep the land producing well. But if the people were disobedient, then there would be trouble. The land wouldn't be fertile or fruitful anymore. So in that land, the crops don't produce enough food, the cattle are skinny, the trees have been cut down. God still sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous, but instead of the rain entering the soil and helping the crop to grow, a lot of the water runs off, and what soaks in often evaporates. So that's the situation in Niger. And the verses in Leviticus 26 that I'm about to bring up describe that very well. I'll just read them to you. Leviticus 26, God's telling his people that if they're obedient, then this is the blessings they will enjoy. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees of the field their fruit. Then down in verse 9, I will look on you with favour and make you fruitful and increase your numbers, and I will keep my covenant with you. You will still be eating last year's harvest. You will still be eating last year's harvest when you'll have to move it out to make room for the new. And so for the people in Niger, often, for most of them, their harvest runs out. The yield that they got from the year before runs out before the next wet season even. And so those verses are wonderful to know that God wanted to bless his people such that their harvest lasted till the following harvest came in. That's just a great blessing. But I mentioned there was also problems if they weren't obedient. And so it says in the second part of Leviticus 26, there's a whole list of bad things that will happen, but it also says this, if you will not listen to me and carry out all these commands, if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out all my commands, I'll do this to you. In verse 19 it says, I'll break down your stubborn pride and make the sky above you like iron and the ground beneath you like bronze. Your strength will be spent in vain because your soil will not yield its crops, nor will the trees of the land yield their fruit. So those verses are very real to the people in West Africa. This photo was taken in Burkina, and this year they said the rains weren't sufficient, so the crops weren't producing. But if you can see in the right of the picture, there's an ebony tree. It's a tree that produces good fruit. People can eat it, but it was cut down. The branches fell on the left side. The crop there has done well because the soil was made more fertile through all the leaves that fell down. And so when it rained, that crop did well. Just a few metres away, the crop is very poor. It's not even up to your knees. And so for people to say there wasn't enough rain, that photo shows that it was more that the sky's become like iron, the ground has become like bronze. Their strength is being spent in vain. And so the verses in Leviticus aren't just words that God said, but they actually have come to fruition in that part of the world. And as you read through the Old Testament, you get to the book of Judges. They do enter the promised land, but then you get to the book of Judges and you find that they can't live up to to being obedient to God like they should have. And then the book of Ruth, the first verse says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land. And that was the land that was meant to be flowing with milk and honey. So you can see that God's promise did come true, that if they weren't obedient, then they would suffer the consequences. And so I'll move on with the slideshow. Some of the rules that I taught to the people that God gives in his word, one was in Deuteronomy 20 verse 19. In this verse, God says to his people when they're at war, when they lay siege to a city, they shouldn't cut down the fruit trees. So he's saying, even the trees of your enemies you shouldn't cut down. So it's for people in peacetime in their own land, even more they should protect the trees because the trees are food for them. In this verse in Deuteronomy 22, it says, if you find a bird's nest beside the road, you may take the young, but leave the mother. And so God's saying, you can use what I've given you for your benefit, but don't use it up so that it isn't able to benefit you anymore. You have to care for what I've given you so that it can keep being effective in the way that I've made it. And so for the Fulani people, they were really surprised to see that there were verses like that that taught us how to care for the land. Then in Leviticus 25, God said that the people shouldn't sell the land because it belonged to him and they were just his tenants. And so that reminded me of the parable in Matthew 25, the parable of the tenants, where the landowner goes on a journey and leaves 3 of them in charge, gives them a large sum of money each to look after. And then when he comes back, the first servant comes to him with the biggest amount of money and says, "You gave this to me, it's earned this much more." And the master says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And then the second one, the same response. But the third one, he was afraid. He went and hid the money in the ground, and he came to the master and says, "Here's what you gave me." And the master said, "You wicked servant, you were very lazy," and asked them to throw him out in the darkness. And so I asked the Fulani, what did the third servant do wrong? He wasn't given any instructions in the start of the parable what he should do with the money, and he returned the money, so he didn't steal, and he didn't obviously disobey. But you can see from the response of the other 2 that what he did wrong was that he didn't value what the master had given him. He didn't do anything with it. He didn't increase the value of it. And so Jesus gives that parable, I believe, to show us that the blessings that he's given us, he wants us to use for his glory and to increase the blessing. And so when a subsistence farmer comes to you and says, as a follower of Jesus, how should I farm my land? They often feel they're farmers because that's what they have to do. They don't have any other option. And they feel they're very poor and needy. But when we were there, I tried to help them realize God has given you many blessings. All these things that God has given you, things that he's given you to use, that you can get benefit from and increase the value of. And so the practical side of my course was showing them how can they make better use of the rainfall? How can they even increase the rainfall? How can they make better use of the trees and increase the amount of grass that grows? All those different things. And all these things, even if you're a rich man, you can't buy rain or you can't buy fertile soil. You can't buy more trees for your land. You have to wait for them to grow. God's the one that makes them grow. So I was trying to help them realize that they're not powerless, but that God's given them abilities to improve what he's given them, and when he comes back, give it back to him in better condition than when they received it. So just quickly going through these points. As a follower of Jesus, we should show love for God and love for our neighbour. We should live with thanksgiving for all that he's given us. We should care for the land knowing that it's God's. So even if it's not our land, we can still care for the land that doesn't specifically belong to us because it belongs to the King of Kings. And we should endeavour to increase the value of the gifts that he's given us. So in the course, I often told them the bad things that they'd been doing and how they could improve that. There was also this verse that I showed them that in Revelation it says that judgment's coming on those who destroy the earth. And so I felt, well, I may have discouraged them because I had given them so many reasons that they had not been doing the right thing or that there was trouble coming. But I also wanted to give them hope. And in Job 14, 7-10, there's some verses there that Job's replying to his friends. He's saying, if man dies, well, you bury him and that's it, that's the end. But if a tree's cut down, it'll sprout again. And in a place like Niger, the trees have been cut down, but they're sprouting again. And if those trees are cared for, then the land can become fertile again. But there's not just hope because of the way God made trees. There's also hope because of who he is. Our God's a compassionate and gracious God. He's slow to anger and abounding in love. Maintains love to thousands and forgives wickedness, rebellion and sin. But he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. So that's quite different to the God of Islam. He isn't a God of compassion or a God of grace. Even really fervent Muslims don't know whether they'll be allowed into heaven or not when they die. And so our God gives us great hope. But it says that he forgives wickedness, rebellion and sin. So there's a need to repent. And the verse I want to read to you from 2 Chronicles on repentance is really wonderful. This context of this is that Solomon has dedicated the temple and he's asked God to dwell in the temple. And so God says, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. So we can see in that the verses in Leviticus 26 had come to pass. People's land had been become infertile and hard to get enough food to eat. But God said if they repent and turn back to him, then he'll forgive their sin and he'll heal their land. And I think we often don't take notice of that heal their land bit. We just concentrate on, as going out into the mission field, we want people to have their sins forgiven, and then we sort of forget about the day-to-day living side of it. And we're really glad to be able to show people in word and deed that there's hope for the present, but there's also hope for the future. And so we're planning to go back in a month or month and a half. And when we go back this next term, we're preparing to lead a team. We're hoping that a team of people might come and join us. We learnt about something that Africa Inland Mission has been doing for 20 years, running teams called TIMO teams, and that stands for Training in Ministry Outreach. And so we'd really love it if some of you might consider coming to join us to reach the Fulani. There's still an unreached people group. There's some that are believers, but there's many who still haven't heard the good news of Jesus. And there's about a bit less than 2 million of them in Niger. And so we'd love it if a team of people would come and join us. It's a commitment of 2 years. And during that 2 years, you learn the language and the culture and go through a curriculum that some Bible colleges accredit. So you can look into that, BC MST. And so that's one way you could be involved. Another way is by praying. We'll have a prayer card up the back. Or if you're planning to go to a third world country, you could, as well as doing this course here, you could go and investigate a permaculture course or something like that to know how you can become all things to people who are subsistence farmers. So that's, I think, as much time as I've given. So thanks for having us. We'd love to talk to you afterwards, and it's really wonderful to be able to come and join you here today.